How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, June the 25th. Donald Trump has given his first verdict on Andy Burnham. The US president said that he had heard Burnham was extremely liberal, which sounded wary, but not yet outright hostile. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Wary but not outright hostile is the vibe on this podcast. But for a want to touch of something nice, many, many happy returns, Anne. It is Anne McElvoy's birthday.
Darn, you found it. Moving on.
Donald Trump also described Andy Burnham as the mayor of a town. The whole tone of the way that Donald Trump talked about Andy Burnham and Britain in general was quite interesting. So just let's listen to the whole thing. It's only 30 seconds.
I don't know anything. I see that he was, I guess, the mayor of a town. I hear he's extremely liberal. Extremely. So that means he probably won't open up the North Sea. You know, I gave Keir Starmer some pretty good advice. I said, open up the North Sea. I told this guy 15 times, and he wouldn't do it. I said, you're going to lose your prime ministership. And he did. In fact, I called it about 3 days early, right? Remember I said he was leaving? I wonder if that nudged him out.
Yes, Trump's go-to point there about drilling in the North Sea, well, he might be a beat behind, Sam, because there are signals that Andy Burnham may be prepared to go there. I'm not sure that there's a record of the Trump-Starmer call from 3 days ago either, so maybe that's a previous reference. And I wondered whether the president reckoned that Burnham was the mayor of Makerfield when he talked about the town. I mean, you can't really miss Manchester, can you? Anyway, so many questions. Burnham will have a lifetime of comments about Donald Trump to be thrown back at him, no doubt. On the stump on the way to Makerfield, Burnham said that the UK needed to avoid what he called the polarised, poisonous politics of the US.
In that way that we do on this podcast, I had a little sort of 5 a.m. scout around for comments by Andy Burnham about Donald Trump. And I'm quite struck. I mean, it's perfectly possible that I've missed some, and I obviously haven't watched every single or listened to every single BBC Manchester phone-in that Andy Burnham did. But at first glance, they're not that bad. They're certainly not on the scale of, you know, David Lammy, Sadiq Khan, who was calling Trump racist and fascist and Nazi sympathizer and you know, other things that Labour folks say. The sort of toughest one I can find in February 2025 was Trump bringing instability to the US and the world. So it's that kind of level. So actually, it doesn't look like there are too many hostages to fortune, you know, as far as me and some 5 a.m. AI could find.
5 a.m. AI show. Yeah, thinking about that comment that you made about polarisation, I mean, you can get away with that one, can't you? Because if you're polarising, you're suggesting that there's another pole to Donald Trump as well that's got something to do with that. Of course, Keir Starmer will get a last word with President Trump at the NATO summit in Ankara in a couple of weeks. And it's been a relationship which one way or the other has dominated the premiership for all sorts of reasons. It reminds us as well that this on-off dealing with Donald Trump gets a whole new cycle, and there is quite a lot of unfinished business over trade and a few other things still on the table. I'm picking up uncertainty overseas, Sam, about what Andy Burnham stands for, or indeed who he is. You know, certainly in my world, when I'm asked to comment or write in continental Europe, I just get a lot of having to tell the whole Andy Burnham story all over again. One thing that it just made me think about was how far will he go as the likely next Prime Minister with the Keir Miles thing, going abroad a lot to push for deals himself? Or does he leave it more to a foreign secretary? Who will that be? And will he use that off-the-cuff humour to deal with Trump brickbats? Although it's a bit of a risky one, isn't it, to get into a humour race with Donald Trump?
It is. We're going to end today's podcast with just a little section on those Andy Burnham funny videos that he's been doing. But let's do the sort of serious stuff first. I was struck by how little we know about Andy Burnham and foreign policy, because he's always had domestic-facing jobs, like in cabinet as well as in Manchester. I know, for instance, in Manchester, he cultivated the Irish, and there's a sort of consulate up in Greater Manchester. So there is the sort of pro-Europeanism stuff is quite clear. But we don't know the sort of tone, and also there's the uncertainty of who he puts in as foreign secretary. And you're right, the kind of, does he do the Keir Miles thing or not is a big question. Does he use the job of foreign secretary to placate somebody, which I think really, if we're being honest, is what Keir Starmer did with Yvette Cooper when he moved it from the Home Office? Or does he go for something big, bold, splashy? One name that keeps being mentioned to me, David Miliband, coming back from the US. Obviously returning to a job if that's what happens. I think there is a sort of openness amongst some around Burnham to Miliband D, joining Miliband E in the fray. But of course, the downside of that, just sort of slightly constitutionally, is that he, like David Cameron, had to do the job from the Lords.
Yes, Miliband D and Miliband E together, and then we would also, of course, have that new chief of staff coming in from the Blair Brown era. We really would be getting the band together again. On David Miliband, I think there is one wrinkle in that he's been pretty outspoken, I think, about Donald Trump. I mean, he was even joking with friends not long ago about the last speculation that he could be ambassador to the US, not a US ambassador, but that it would have been a tough gig for him to rub along in Trump world. And I think the suggestion was that he was in the frame if it had been a Kamala Harris win, but it wouldn't have worked out so well under Trump. Anyway, I suppose we should put the cart and the horse in the right order before everybody gets in there. And James Pinnell, I should say I was referencing as the new chief of staff, not the present constellation. Today, we're going to find out when we'll get a new Prime Minister with a bit more clarity. The NEC, the National Executive of Labour, meeting to discuss that timetable. Might it slip a few days to the last week of July? Because I think Andy Burnham has been pretty keen to have more time to prepare. Are you hoovering up anything on that?
I think there is a little bit of that floating around. I can't, if I'm in all honesty, I can't judge how forceful that feeling is. There's a sort of a big old grump going on inside Labour's National Executive Committee, because they were effectively presented with a timetable earlier this week about what's going to happen and when. And I think some sort of NEC officers want to sort of stand their ground. But I don't, even if it slips a few days to sort of a week beyond the end of Parliament, so that kind of week of July the 22nd, I don't think that's a huge deal, and Andy Burnham will be in before August. But at this point, if you pull the camera back, there's a much bigger point that's just worth saying, and it is something you can say now that you couldn't even say a couple of days ago, which is there has been a coup and it has been a success. Right? How do I define that? Well, I've spent the last 36 hours touring Parliament and going around the summer events that take place, and I think I came to the conclusion last night. This has been a really remarkably well-planned coup. Now, of course, there are people who aren't thrilled by what's going on in the Labour Party, who are inside the tent, but really, by and large, MPs are going along with this transition with kind of remarkable grace. Let me point out what we're not hearing, because this is really important. We are not hearing Labour MPs going on the record now to challenge Andy Burnham. Right? At this point in all the Tory races, we were, and that's what I mean. The politics of this has been handled, very well and very carefully. So there aren't the different factions, fighting it out. You saw Wes Streeting lead the sort of the procession of people giving up on their own ambitions to nominate Andy Burnham. And what I think is really interesting, and it's sort of been slightly hiding in plain sight, is this has been the plan, Anne, for months. I was talking to somebody last night, who said that he was talking to one of the planners who was saying in February they were told this basically is the idea, and it's just been executed very well.
Touring summer events. I have to just cycle back quickly to that, which is Sam Coates saying that he went to a lot of parties this week. But we will let that pass. If you tell us what you mean by a coup, it sounds slightly, reminds me of Mikhail Gorbachev being holed up in a dacha in Foros while they fought for control of the Soviet Union in his day. Are you really suggesting that this was planned out in advance, as opposed to Andy Burnham gets the momentum, gets Makerfield behind him, and then everybody presses go? The Prime Minister's been weak for a long time, and it just falls apart. But you seem to be saying something a bit more intentional.
Oh, God, yeah. No, absolutely. By the way, first of all, busted. Yes, I was at a party. It was a cross-party party on a boat. And that's where I was talking to somebody about this. But the point is, Anne, if I put together some of my conversations and some of the conversations I'm having with other people, stuff being said in October, November, December, January, February, there were lots of people with lots of different ideas. But when you look back at the architects of this, and I think the key figure really has been Louise Haigh, quite a lot of the things that she was telling, friends and others a few months ago just have literally come to pass. Now, I'm not saying that every single spit and cough was written down on a tablet of stone. Of course not. There was the mess around Gordon and Denton and whether Andy Burnham would stand there, although the consensus now is having him in a green-facing seat wouldn't give him the kind of mandate to take on reform that's been a necessary part of the argument for why he should return to Downing Street. So the events around Makerfield, well, some might see that as part of a master plan. It felt like a little bit of a kind of last minute, it was a little bit of last minute luck to get that over the line. But the broad contours and some big decisions, yes, were taken, months ago. And I think the big one that I would identify was, Louise Haigh putting together the Tribune group, thereby giving her a kind of caucus in the backbenches. But then I think it was really her that decided more than anybody else that her person would be Andy Burnham and not, for instance, Angela Rayner. I think that was a big and difficult moment that happened behind the scenes. And the reason that happened was in part because she saw polling. In fact, there was some polling on this podcast, I think, played into it. And I mentioned it at the time. There was polling that suggests that Angela Rayner just isn't popular enough amongst the general public. But that moment that Angela Rayner sort of suddenly, who'd been written about for months and years as a pretender to the crown and didn't get Tribune on her side, I think that was a big moment, a big fork in the road. And I think the handling of the Parliamentary Labour Party through the last few days also was something that a lot of thought has been put into. So was there a plan? Yes, I do think there was. And I think it's interesting that Louise Haigh saw this as the answer, even though, if you remember, Andy Burnham had a disastrous conference last September, but the numbers were always there for him, and she saw that. The other person, by the way, who saw this a long time in advance was Shabana Mahmood. She's one of those who I think got on the Burnham bandwagon last autumn, not in 2026, and that I think that is one of those things that was going to give her quite a bit of leverage and power.
It's so intriguing that you mentioned Shabana Mahmood, because I'd also heard from sort of blue Labour circles that there's a bit of a war for her ear, really, to try to influence Andy Burnham more in that direction. And he has kind of backed off to a certain extent, being identified with the soft left. I don't think that's a tag that he particularly wants to have around his neck when he goes into Downing Street. But of course, he does still have expectations from those quarters that they will expect to be heavily represented, some policies that have that DNA. But yes, I think Mahmood, often in shorthand written about as being the most right-wing person in the current constellation or something similar to that, also does have a good and I think quite regular relationship and dealings with Burnham. So let's look at another big beast in the Starmer cabinet who must be thinking about her future, and that is Rachel Reeves. Now, she's given a BBC interview today saying, scoop, that she backs Andy Burnham, and she's asked explicitly about whether she could be demoted to another cabinet role that is not chancellor. And she says, she absolutely just spits out all the straightforward line: I am not going to preempt the decisions the new Prime Minister will make. I am backing Andy. I think he'll be a great Prime Minister, but those are his decisions, not mine to make. So she didn't use the moment to say, well, I hope he keeps me on.
But I think that's her intention. I mean, what politician wouldn't want to be in a cabinet? In fairness to you, Anne, yesterday you were going to tell me what you were hearing about Rachel Reeves and what her team was up to, and we basically didn't have time. And I want to return that to that today. So what have you been hearing about her team and what they've been saying to business?
Well, in fairness, this is a bit of a hive brain, a multi-sourced tale. Your colleague, Mark Kleiman at Sky, broke out that Reeves's business advisor, her former chief of staff, very trusted figure, Katie Martin, had sounded out major firms and trade bodies in insurance, banking, defence, and the like, urging them to lobby Andy Burnham to keep Rachel Reeves at the Treasury. Now, Politico's Dan Bloom, my colleague, also reporting that the non-too-subtle message that a lot of big business figures were getting was, is there anything you can do to help support Rachel right now? And another figure that I had spoken to with a big kind of history in the city and also very much in a kind of new sort of tech environment where Reeves is very keen to see more growth and more investment, confirmed to me that this was exactly the message that he had been receiving too. Now, in fact, Reeves probably does have most support at the moment in the city of the runners and riders for Chancellor, largely for fear of something worse and a jump in the cost of borrowing, which was one thing that my sort of person that I was speaking to was pointing out, that you could factor in that might happen, and particularly if the choice landed badly with the markets. It's fair to say in those quarters, Ed Miliband is not the dish of choice, though I think he still has aspirations towards number 11. But I would say, in fairness to Miliband, that again, he's often written a bit like Shabana Mahmood, in shorthand. He's the most left-wing candidate. He's not friendly to business. He once talked about predators versus producers, and that went down very badly many years ago. But I would say, if you're in the big nuclear push, things like getting small modular reactors off the ground, energy transitions, renewables, him getting his private investment up to 100 billion, he announced this week, in clean energy. He does get better reviews in the private sector in those quarters, and a big fish in infrastructure telling me yesterday he was the only minister they'd witnessed in Whitehall who had a plan and didn't just throw out policies and hope someone enacted them. So, I think that battle is still very much on.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. As the Times says this morning, and as we've said in this podcast before, Ed Miliband's feeding into economic policy and is just sort of like a policy hub for other cabinet teams at the moment. People are noting Louise Haigh is talking a lot to Pat McFadden, I think, about welfare and other things, but I think his name keeps coming up as well in the runners and riders. I don't think Rachel Reeves is going to hang on, but I see that actually getting people to talk up how good she was in the job of Chancellor is not unhelpful to getting a decentish job elsewhere in the cabinet. Right. One last thing to turn to, and that's how Andy Burnham presents himself, because there's been a warning, hasn't there, Anne?
I was struck this morning, the TUC getting in on the act, writing on Labour list Paul Novak, saying any honeymoon period will be vanishingly short. The wealthy and the powerful and their backers in the right-wing press are trying to water down the agenda of any future prime minister, which it did remind me that there's going to have to be some very quick decisions made about how to communicate Burnham and whatever Burnhamism turns out to be in number 10 outside the Labour tribe. Now, Keir Starmer, we've discussed a lot on this podcast together, has cycled through quite a few comms bosses and constellations. And it reminded me of just a nugget that I picked up on what you call the research rounds, and I call summer parties, that suggested a name in the frame could be Bob Roberts, a political editor of The Mirror, formerly ex-director of communications at the Labour Party, very close to Ed Miliband, so it would suggest some commonality of planning across Ed Miliband and Andy Burnham, if that were the case. He's also been at the City of London and interim comms director for the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. So, that would cover off quite a lot of bases in terms of contacts and expertise. Don't know it for certain, just thought I'd put it out there and see if any fish rise to respond to that.
Interesting. I certainly would take quite a lot to tempt him back, but he's an interesting name in the frame. That's, as it were, the old media debate. What's really fascinating about Andy Burnham is the new media debate. Because just before we leave you to 4 days of birthday celebrations, I wanted to touch just on Andy Burnham's video operation, because that's the thing you're having lots of conversations in Whitehall and Westminster about, because it's just quite eye-catching. He's doing it really well, right? Those snappy, folksy videos, multiple a day at the moment. You know, there was one where he did a little video making fun of Kemi Badenoch at PMQs and her comment about eyelashes and black t-shirts, and videoed himself go, I think this is dark blue, and just generally narrating his own tale. And are you a fan of these, Anne?
I am, actually. I think it's really hard to beat Andy in the video wars. And when I looked at the one when you're referring to, where Kemi Badenoch is goading him about the black t-shirt, and then he says it's dark blue, actually. Yeah, I think they're great fun. I do have a question about how and who will be managing this when he goes into number 10, because that's sort of kind of fine at the moment. But if you then find that some terrible tragedy has just broken out, or you have to then immediately pitch into talking about, Gaza or something that's gone awfully wrong on the international or national stage, you have to be a little bit careful, Jake. You get a lot more freedom, I think, before you go behind the black door. But let's see how it gets handled.
Well, the answer to that is really interesting, because it's somebody who's already done it in number 10 and outside number 10. The person behind these videos until August last year was doing it for Keir Starmer, but as part of the sort of tragedy of Keir Starmer, she switched sides. Her name is Abby Tomlinson. She goes everywhere with Andy Burnham. She was in the taxi down from Euston, on Monday, for instance. And she's been in and around Labour and public affairs circles for quite a long time. Some with longer memories might remember as a teenager back in 2015 starting an online campaign to improve the reputation of one Ed Miliband ahead of the 2015 election. It was known as Milifandom, and that's, I think, when she first came to the attention of many. But she looks to me like she's now a very core part of Andy Burnham's messaging. A lot is going to be written about these videos in the coming days, so I just thought we would get in there and mark the territory ourselves first. Being natural and engaging on digital video is not an easy feat, as those of us who are struggling to do that at the moment can testify.
The fandom and the fodom out there probably looking at some of these will know exactly what you mean.
What a massive week. Thank you very much indeed for being with us all the way through it. Have a lovely, lovely, relaxing weekend, and I hope you are treated in the manner to which you are deserving. And we will see you next week for another few days of preparation. See you then.
See you then.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.